So I want to discuss a video that talks about filmmaking and how filmmaking is supposed to be done and done correctly. So fair use, and I will leave the description in the description box for the link. I'm sorry, in the description box, so you can watch the video in its fullest. So fair use.
Also have a TV program and a member section with much more: films, second-hour radio shows, videos, commentary, music, and much more. Filmmaker and author Jay Weidner is with us today on the program to talk about Kubrick's Odyssey, secrets hidden in films of Stanley Kubrick. We begin to look closer at Eyes Wide Shut and how it connects with mind control, the elite, their deviant sexual behavior with orgies and pedophilia. And we explain this in the context of archonic, demonic and satanic forces. Kubrick told an important story with all his films, and they all connect in some way as well. The question is if Kubrick actually was murdered, considering what kind of message he tried to get across to his audience. This has to do with NASA, the Saturnian cult, the secret space program, the Ringmakers, Lord of the Rings, and even Arthur C. Clarke. We span all across the conspiratorial and symbolic board with Jay Weidner, so please stay with us for a fascinating 2 hours. Welcome back to Red Eyes Radio, Jay Weidner. It's been about 3.5 years, I think, since we talked last time back in 2007. It's good to have you with us again, Jay. How are you?
Hey, it's great to be back. I'm great. How are you, Henrik?
I'm excellent. Thank you for asking. You really have been doing a lot of work since we last talked with you. Obviously, I think the biggest and one of the most important development that you've been working on is the new Kubrick films, 3-part series. The first one of these are out right now. It's called Kubrick's Odyssey, and I know, as long as I've been following your work, Jay, that you've been into the works of Kubrick, alchemical Kubrick, as you call him, anyway. What is so alluring about his work, Jay? Maybe we can begin to talk about this and your film, of course.
Stanley Kubrick is, in my view, the most consummate of all filmmakers, because he not only had the intellectual background needed to be a good filmmaker, but he also had the talent. Visual talent. His films are incredibly visual, and they don't seem to erode. Even films as old as Paths of Glory still hold up really well. And so it was a combination of his intellectual skills and his technical skills that attracted me, and the fact that he didn't like to tell stories in the way that Hollywood prefers stories to be told, and that attracted me. But most of all, it's his content, and each film takes a different part of the human drama and breaks it apart so that we can understand it and therefore ourselves a lot better. And my whole thesis, of course, is that he was, after Dr. Strangelove, when the military saw the technical feat that he did creating the B-52 bombers, they realized that this guy was really good, and they hired him to do the Apollo moon landings, which is not to say they didn't go to the moon. I do believe they have gone to the moon, but I don't believe what they showed us was really true, and I think I proved beyond any shadow of a doubt in the new film, Kubrick's Odyssey, how he did it, showing devastating evidence of it. And then I go into The Shining, which is not really about a Stephen King novel at all. It's really the secret story of what Stanley had to go through while he was doing the Apollo landings, and what he put his wife through and his family and himself through. And that I have a serious amount of new evidence, which is going to really make some people squirm. And people think that I'm going to get sued by NASA or the Kubrick family, and I really don't think I am going to get sued, because if they do sue me, I'm going to take them to court, and I'm going to bring in Hollywood special effects artists who are going to testify in court that I am right about the front screen projection process and its use in the Apollo program. So if they want to take me to court, let's go for it. Let's get a jury. And we'll let them decide whether Stanley Kubrick faked the Apollo moon landings or not.
Mm-hmm.
And I would predict that I win by a long shot.
Interesting. Yeah, well, as long as they don't have the control of the court, I guess, in that sense. But that's another
Well,
story.
I mean, I would demand a jury. I would demand a jury trial. I wouldn't let the judge make the judgment.
Yeah.
I would. There are certain things that you can do in the United States, and my bet is that they're not going to do it for several reasons. Number one, of course, is business reasons. I'm going to increase the sales of Stanley Kubrick DVDs over the next years, and they're greedy, and so I don't think they're going to complain just because of that single reason right there.
Do you think that Stanley Kubrick was murdered, as some people have speculated about?
Well, I don't know. I wasn't there, but in 1999, when I first released the Alchemical Kubrick article, I got a mysterious phone call from an anonymous person who was one of Kubrick's assistants. And he would not tell me his name, but he answered certain questions well enough for me to know that he definitely knew Stanley. And he thought that. He was there when Kubrick showed the film to the Warner Brothers executives. Apparently, Stanley smoked about 15 cigarettes in the lobby of the theater during the 2.5 hours that it was showing to the Warner Brothers executives, and Stanley was extremely worried. And they came out and they were very disappointed in the film, and told him that it needed to be edited heavily, and he refused. And he went home and died, and there's a lot of other strange things that went on during that whole thing. And so, is Kubrick like Mozart? Did he release secrets and then die? I think he did, and the reason I think he did is because even though Eyes Wide Shut is severely edited, and even though Eyes Wide Shut has severe continuity errors in it, which Kubrick would have never let happen, which means that things have been cut out in between the shots, enough is in it to make one realize that Eyes Wide Shut is really a film about Operation Monarch, which is a CIA operation, which uses beauty queens to mind controls beauty queens to infiltrate various organizations and things like that. What's interesting about Eyes Wide Shut is that, and I'm having a total blank now on the name of Sidney Pollack, but Sidney Pollack's name in the movie, and he's the guy who's playing pool at the end and telling Tom Cruise not to mess with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the doctor.
His name, the doctor, his name in Yiddish is Bricklayer, and Bricklayer is, of course, Mason. And he's obviously the head of it. So, he's the head of the Masons. And Kubrick is telling you pretty clearly by using his name that is so. And then you begin looking at other things in Eyes Wide Shut, like the fact that the orgy scene in Eyes Wide Shut was filmed at Nathan Rothschild's mansion outside London. And you begin to put together these things, and you begin to realize that Kubrick, I don't know why, but he felt the need to fully explain everything of the occult kind before he died. And it really helps people like me who are going through his films and trying to untangle them to have Eyes Wide Shut, because it confirms that there was an occult connection in Kubrick's life, and I believe Eyes Wide Shut is really the story of Stanley Kubrick. I believe that he did go to these parties. I do believe that he did rub shoulders with the elites of the world, and he did their bidding. But just like Tom Cruise and just like Jack Nicholson in The Shining, even though it appears that he's been accepted into this group. In reality, he is not accepted and will never be accepted, and will forever, just like Jack Nicholson will forever be the caretaker of the Overlook, so too will Tom Cruise always be just the house doctor to the elite. Mm-hmm. And so you're accepted into an outer circle as a servant to them. And that's what Kubrick felt that he was just a servant to the elite. And this is why he walled himself off in a big estate in London and chased people off with shotguns and things. Notorious, not because he didn't like people, but because he was so bloody paranoid over what he had seen and what he had done and what he knew, mm-hmm. that he didn't want anyone around him because somebody died. Kubrick is obsessed with this idea, both in The Shining and Eyes Wide Shut, that somebody knew something about him and they paid their life for it, whether it's the girl who saves him at the orgy or whether it's Halloran dying in The Shining. He told somebody something. They died because of what Kubrick told him, and this haunted Stanley all the way to the end of his days. Mm-hmm. And this is why he was a recluse and why he was so strange. And I think it's completely and totally understandable. And, Kubrick was just a young guy when he got involved in this. He was only 33 when he started getting into this, and it looked good to him. It looked sexy. It's like the scene in The Shining where Jack Nicholson sees the beautiful woman and he starts kissing her and she turns into an old hag who starts laughing at him. Well, that scene's not in the book. That scene is Stanley telling you that he thought this was going to be a sexy thing. This was going to be totally cool. We're going to do the Apollo moon landings, be accepted into the elite, make any movie he wanted. And it turned out instead to be an old hag laughing at him, exactly the opposite of what he expected. Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. What do you think is as you point out here, there's a kind of a story that is being told through many of his films and many different kinds of secrets and many different dramas playing out. But do you think that there is a single one most important piece of information that he was getting out through his movies? And if so, was that the reason why he was potentially taken out as well?
Yeah, I think you can see that, the way he starts it out, Paths of Glory. Well, The Killing is really about how his obsession with time and how he breaks time up into different segments, and you can be in the future, and then you can go into the past, and then you can be in the present, and all these things are happening all at once. Incredibly ambitious for a guy in his 20s in the 1950s. Paths of Glory is a whole story of what World War I really did to Europe and the corruption that it caused in Europe. And Dr. Strangelove is, his view on the military-industrial complex. 2001 is his alchemical view. Clockwork Orange is about mind control, and ironically, it appears as if the astronauts themselves were clockwork oranged into the fact that a lot of them can't remember what was going on the moon. Mm-hmm. For instance, Edwin Mitchell could not remember what happened to him on the moon, on Apollo 14, and he went to the famous hypnotherapist Robert Masters, whom I knew while he was alive, and Robert Masters told me that Mitchell came to him very troubled because he couldn't remember what it was like to be on the moon, and they took him through a deep amount of hypnotherapy to recover the memories, and they never recovered them. Because they weren't there. And Buzz Aldrin, in his book Return to Earth, which he wrote about the Apollo missions, he talks about the 1-year anniversary of Apollo 11, and he's on the stage at Las Vegas, a big celebration for the 1-year anniversary, and a reporter says, "Hey, Buzz, come on, tell us the truth. What was it like to be on the moon?" And in his own words, and you can read it in the book, he says, "I started quivering, my legs got weak, I wanted to throw up, I went out, I couldn't speak anymore, I went out into the alley and smoked cigarettes until I could recover." So he was clockwork oranged. As soon as the subject came up, he got ill. This is why Neil Armstrong won't do any interviews, because he's probably going to get sick
Right.
talking about it.
Yeah.
And, so this is, Kubrick was telling us about the mind control that was going on before we actually even knew there was such a thing as mind control. And the same thing, Barry Lyndon is about, again, getting close to the elites, but never really being accepted by the elites. You can have the name of the elites, you can have the look and the mannerisms of the elites, but you can never get in. Barry Lyndon could never really get into the elites. The Shining is a story of the Apollo missions and a lot more. Also pedophilia, which is another recurrent theme within the work of Stanley Kubrick, which sits under the surface. But it may be that one of the reasons that Stanley was offed was that the real story of AI was going to be a story of pedophilia cults, and they really didn't want that one to get out. So I think he was planning a 1-2 punch. He was planning an Eyes Wide Shut AI punch that was going to not only, solidify his stature, but was going to reveal the final secrets of this occult society, and he was snuffed out. Spielberg took the script and rewrote it and put out a pathetic film, and the rest is history.
We know, obviously, that... as you say, Spielberg took over AI, and there's probably very little left of what Kubrick worked on in that movie. But more curiously, we know that Eyes Wide Shut wasn't really completed as well, wasn't it? Now, there was many parts missing, there were scenes missing, and certain things, to me, to this day, when I watch the movie, doesn't make sense. And I wonder what portion, they left out there. What do you make of that, Jay?
Well, I think they left out the Monarch programming part. I think that Nicole Kidman was at the orgy, for instance. I think she was wearing a mask, and she was there when Tom Cruise takes off his mask. I think that the Hungarian is at the beginning of the film that's dancing with Nicole. Kubrick is part of this group, and he seduces her, of which they cut out. I think that the entire scene at the end with Sidney Pollack has been completely re-edited. And there's a series of dream sequences, which I saw when I was in France, before the film was released, which are definitely removed. And these were eerie, strange Monarch programming type scenes with Nicole Kidman, which were really scary, and they vanished into thin air. This assistant who called me told me that Stanley was really worried about certain parts of Eyes Wide Shut, and that the people running the studio would be offended. But he had a contract, an ironclad contract, with Warner Brothers that said that no one could touch his films, and so the only film of Stanley Kubrick's outside of Spartacus that the editing was not done by Stanley is Eyes Wide Shut. And that's a bloody shame. And I would have loved to have seen the movie, but you can tell that the movie isn't done by certain peculiarities which any filmmaker knows, which is if you watch a film, there's this aggravating, continuing repeating of lines. So somebody will say, I saw you at the party last night. And then Tom Cruise will say, the party last night? Right? These kinds of things. Mm-hmm. These are things that you shoot for good acting, but you cut out in the editing process. Right? This repeating of lines.
Right.
It's a movie thing to get the actors relaxed into their role, but you cut it out. You don't have them repeat. And so we know that Kubrick had at least one more pass on the editing bench, at least, before the film was going to be released. And they just went in with a meat cleaver and chopped out all the important stuff and left in all the mistakes. I don't know why,
Yeah.
But I do know why. And so you look at it and you can see there's this continuous thread underneath the all of his movies, which is about a cult of people who run the world, and what unites this cult, according to Kubrick anyway, is an overarching obsession with children and sex.
Yeah.
I hate to say it, but that's what's going on. And when I get into the third film, I'm going to lower the boom on that, and I'm going to prove it beyond any shadow of a doubt. And the few people I've shown it to were almost sick with nausea after I showed it to them. And Kubrick was definitely putting it in there because, you see, here's the thing about Kubrick. He knew what was going on, and he wanted us to know what was going on, but he couldn't tell us because his wife and his kids would get killed, okay? Or him. I mean, maybe he died. Who knows? So he put these things into his films knowing that they wouldn't be discovered until long after he died.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then the films would be out already, and there's no way you could put the genie back in the bottle. So all it needed was one person to come along and say, hey, have you ever noticed this and this and this and this and this? And then the picture emerges of what is being said to you, and you realize that Stanley Kubrick is laying it all on the line, telling us exactly what's happening, and it's really exciting.
Pedophilia. I always wondered what some of the reasons for this activity is. This is definitely, one of the threads that is running through the whole idea of an upper establishment and an elite. Now, when you work with this, have you come to any kind of conclusion when it comes to why? There's two different scenarios as far as I see it here. One is this is being done in order to blackmail the people in the network. This is a way to have a hold on people who are joining this inner circle that you talked about. The other branch to this is that this have ritualistic, satanic aspects in nature and at the core of it. Maybe both are right, maybe both are wrong. What do you make of this, Jay?
Well, I would say both are right. It is definitely an energy-sucking occult archon thing, which seeks to destroy innocence. Pedophiles are not turned on by young children. Pedophiles are turned on by the idea that they can destroy that young child's innocence. Okay? That's what they like. And that's archonic. That's a demonic archon draining the innocence out of someone kind of thing. And this is what they were doing at the sex orgy in Eyes Wide Shut. And if you really examine the film Lolita, you can see that Peter Sellers and his lady companion are part of a pedophile network that are running down children and trying to get James Mason into their pedophile cult. And he's so naive he doesn't realize that he's being invited into the cult. Okay, and his love for Lolita is so strong that he just blinded by it, and he doesn't realize what he's being told by Peter Sellers and his lady companion. And again, later in Eyes Wide Shut, when Tom Cruise comes to the costume shop and finds out that the girl there is not really an innocent at all, she's part of her father's pedophile service. And so it's both. It's how do you compromise, which maybe even Stanley had been compromised. It's entirely possible. And another thing which is interesting about all this, which I'll get into in the third film, is that all through Stanley Kubrick's films are these teddy bears. They're everywhere in all of his films. At the very last, I think it's the last shot of Eyes Wide Shut, is Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman watching their daughter walk down the aisle in the shopping store, surrounded by bears, teddy bears. Now, if you type in pedophile and bears on Google, you'll discover that there's a insignia called Pedo Bear, which is what pedophiles use to tag a kid who might be interested. Okay? And it's a little teddy bear. And if you go further into this, you find out that pedophiles call them pedophiles who are hairy are referred to as bears. Okay? And frankly, Stanley Kubrick comes off as a bear when you look at him. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that he was a pedophile. I don't think he was. But I think the pedophiles referred to him as a bear because he was hairy. And don't forget that Arthur C. Clarke is a notorious pedophile who was one of Stanley's best friends in London at the time of making it 2001. And so we see that he's hanging out with Arthur C. Clarke and his group of people who are mysteriously linked into the German scientists that Arthur C. Clarke is trying to get into NASA in the early 60s. And you begin to realize that there's a deeper connection here between Arthur C. Clarke's predilections and NASA. And I mean, it gets really strange. I mean, there's all sorts of odd things going on inside this story, that don't seem connected, but actually they may be. Mm-hmm. For instance, one of the things that drove Jim Garrison crazy in the Kennedy investigation, in the assassination of Kennedy, was that right before he got the job at the school book depository, Lee Harvey Oswald was working at a company called Riley's Coffee Company in New Orleans. And when Garrison went to talk to all the employees at Riley's Coffee Company about Lee Harvey Oswald, he discovered that there were no more employees there, even though it was only a year or two later that knew Lee Harvey Oswald. So he decided to track down these ex-employees and find out where they were and talk to them. And guess where they all went? They all moved to Houston and became members of NASA.
Okay.
The strange thing to move from an employee of a coffee company to an employee of NASA, I find.
Sure.
And Garrison went to his death. He wrote me a couple times about this, and he went to his death trying to figure out why there was this NASA connection everywhere that he looked, including Texas, where Kennedy was killed, which is Johnson was, really NASA's senator. That's what he was called. And so you look at this and you can see that, you look at Barry Nelson at the beginning of The Shining, the manager of the Overlook, and he has a toupee that makes him a dead ringer for JFK, okay? And you start looking at all this stuff and you realize that he's trying to tell you this, right? And it just gets stranger and stranger. I mean, I have a list of all the credits of the people who helped Stanley in 2001, and it is a military industrial complex list of all the criminal companies that developed these weapons for the United States. That's who helped him. Why would they help him make a science fiction film? Companies generally just don't contribute employees to other private enterprises for free. So, why are they helping Stanley? Why are they all getting together and helping him? And the answer is because they're fleecing the United States people out of $40 billion that was supposed to go to the Apollo moon program, and by faking it.
And do you think that this money then actually went to the real space program behind the scenes?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. And I think the people that were working on NASA, and those are the people who are the most upset with me, by the way. I get a lot of emails from people who were working at Rocketdyne and McDonnell Douglas and these companies working for NASA, and they're really angry at me because they say, well, I did all this work and you're telling me that it was just a big fake. Well, you did do all the work. It's true. And you did good work, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But you weren't doing it for Apollo. You were doing it for the secret space program. It's quite brilliant, too.
Yeah. Well, exactly. That's quite interesting. I definitely want to talk more about that. That's one thing about the occult NASA connection that I've been reading about that is the most obvious one to me, I guess, in that sense. That has to do with the developments that happened at White Sands, specifically JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. We have people like Jack Parsons and the so-called Babylon Bunch doing some interesting ritual magic connected to the JPL facility and all that as well. That's one of the more obvious ones that I know about. But beyond that, what else is there out there in terms of NASA that are connecting the threads to this the upper elite, the establishment, Jay?
Well, I mean, the most interesting thing, of course, is that the the scientists in Germany that developed all of this stuff were all members of a group called the Saturnian Society, and I'm not, we don't really know all that much about the Saturnian Society, but I just find it interesting that, they named the rocket the Saturn V, even though it was going to the moon, which was strange. And but more interesting than that is the obsession that NASA has had with Saturn. And including sending the big ship that's out there now, collecting thousands and thousands of images of Saturn and its moons, and you just got to wonder what's going on. And if you read Ringmakers of Saturn, which is an astonishing book by a scientist here in the United States, Bergson, about the objects that the Voyager photographed in the rings of Saturn during the Voyager flyby, and the things that that they're picking up now, especially on Titan and the hexagonal rings on Saturn, and things. You start wondering. You have to wonder what Saturn actually is, and the myths around Saturn and everything are just so interesting. And then you realize at a certain point that this cult is a Saturnian cult. And and if you go into the mythology, you realize that Saturn was really that there's a war, kind of a spiritual war between the followers of Jehovah or Jupiter and the followers of Saturn or Set. Okay, Jehovah means Jupiter, Zeus. The followers of Jehovah, the Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews, are actually following Zeus, because Jehovah is Jove, which translates directly to Zeus. And all they did was they just got rid of all the other gods and made Zeus the primary god. And the same thing with Saturn. Saturn was the god before Jehovah. Before the Jovian religions came 3,000 years ago, the people were worshiping Saturn and Set, who is the Egyptian god. And Saturn is time and Chronos and all these things. And you begin thinking that, there's something about Saturn that we haven't quite figured out that they know.
Yeah. And
I think that Saturn might be some kind of hyperdimensional gateway or something. I'm not sure. I just know that there's things that are going on Saturn which are absolutely mind-boggling, and NASA knows about it. And another interesting thing about this is in 2005, there was a TV series in the United States called Revelations. And it only lasted 6 shows. It was a summer replacement. Really wasn't a very good show. And it was financed by the Catholic Church. And in this show, Bill Pullman is a scientist, and there's some beautiful actress, I forget her name. She's playing a nun, believe me, the most beautiful nun you've ever seen. And they're chasing the Antichrist, okay, all over the world, who's about to destroy the world. And in the film, it turns out that the Antichrist has a secret box. And inside, on the front of the box is a picture of Saturn, and there's a moon right next to the picture of Saturn. And Bill Pullman points at the moon, and he says, it's a black moon. And he says, what's this? And the nun says, that's the black moon of Saturn. That's where the Antichrist lives. Well, this is 1 year after they took the pictures of Iapetus,
right,
okay, which is a black moon, about 6 months after Hoagland came out with his brilliant analysis of Iapetus, And at the very end of the series, they defeat the Antichrist, but they got to have a sequel because it's a TV show. And so they're standing out on a cliff overlooking the ocean. They won their battle against the Antichrist, blah blah blah. And they look up at a star, and the camera zooms into the star. Turns out the star is really Saturn, and the very last shot of the show is this black moon rising over the frame, covering the frame. Okay? So this is all very odd because here's the thing. The place where the black monolith is in the book 2001: A Space Odyssey is on the moon Iapetus. Mm-hmm. And you start putting this together and you realize that these guys must have had knowledge. These German guys must have had knowledge about Saturn from something. But they knew that there was something about Saturn. Kubrick was going to Saturn in 2001. In the book, they actually go to Saturn. He changed it to Jupiter, said he couldn't make the rings look realistic enough. I don't buy it. I think they came in and they said, no, man, you can't make it Saturn. It's just too obvious. It's just too clear. You can't have it land on Iapetus because one day we're going to take a picture of Iapetus and they're all going to squawk about the huge coincidences of us, here in 1965, knowing about all this when we're not supposed to know about it. And, or even more intriguing, if my German friends and contacts are right, had already developed technology by 1961, 62, to actually go out there. And they knew all about it by then.
Arthur C. Clarke probably had some knowledge about this then. Do you think that, because you alluded to earlier that he was part of the inner network there in one way or another, right?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm sure that he and Kubrick and Hermann Oberth and Werner von Braun and some of the more secret Germans that we don't know about that were quite brilliant, they sat around in Arthur C. Clarke's apartment drinking brandy and smoking cigars and talking into the night about all this stuff. And Kubrick's this kid practically, right, going, oh my God, what is this, right? And excited and tried to fit it into his scheme of things and got a lot of it in. Another interesting thing is Anthony Burgess was one who wrote Clockwork Orange, was asked one time where he got the idea, and he said he got it from Stanley Kubrick in a conversation in 1964.
Interesting.
So A Clockwork Orange was what happened? Well, maybe Kubrick said, well, listen, I'm not going to do this, fake this Apollo moon landing crap because the astronauts will talk eventually, and then we'll all look like idiots. And they showed him how they could get the astronauts not to talk. He saw the Levico technique and told Burgess about it, and then Burgess wrote a book.
I wanted to, when we talked a bit earlier about Buzz Aldrin, he not too long ago made a comment about a monolith found on Phobos. I bet you saw that one, and if so, why is he speaking about that particular thing right now when he couldn't remember basic stuff about the moon? What is he on about now?
Well, Buzz knows the truth, of course. He knows he didn't go. He knows that there's a secret space program, and he is trying to get us to go get us to reveal it, so that we can go to Phobos and look at this stuff. And, we've already been to Phobos probably several times, and he knows that too. And so, a lot of these guys are irritated. They were told years and years ago that, we'll keep a lid on it, for 10 or 15 years, and then we'll release the fact that we have all this technology, and the world will be a better place because we'll have energy that's clean and efficient and all that. And then they never do it. And these guys like Buzz Aldrin and Richard Hoagland and all these other guys are all irritated that the promises aren't being kept, and so they're pressuring them to release this stuff. But I got news for all of those guys: they are not going to release it ever. We're not. They don't want us to know about it. They don't want us to have it, and there's basic reasons for that too.
So I want to talk a little bit more about some of the symbolism here in terms of Saturn as well. The Lord of the Rings, right, representing time. death. In some cases we can see, the Cronus or Saturn with an hourglass and all this as well. It's quite interesting when you get into it, and I even think that there is a hint of this in the most basic, the NASA logo as well. Many people say it's a rocket taking off with this kind of V or U-shaped, but that looks to me like the red rings of Saturn around a blue planet. What do you make of that, Jay?
I completely agree with you, and yeah, the Lord of the Rings. Okay, so here we have J.R.R. Tolkien, who's the only person who can read the books that are in the basement of the Oxford at Oxford. Okay, he's got all these books from Finland and Sweden, and he's the only guy who can actually read them. All right, and he spends hours and hours, hundreds of hours reading all this stuff that's down there, and he writes Lord of the Rings after he's done reading it. Okay, and he says to his friends like C.S. Lewis, he says there's a whole history and we don't even know about it. And he told people in his letters that Lord of the Rings was about Europe 6,500 years ago. That the Irish were the hobbits and the elves were the Nords, and he had this whole thing figured out. And he said this is all based on truth. And he would get angry when people said, well, this is all analogy and metaphor, and he would say, no, it isn't analogy and metaphor. This is what I learned from my reading. And one of the things he gets is that there's this Lord of the Rings, like Saturn, and his name is Sauron. And Sauron is obviously, so close to the Mesopotamian dictator Sargon, who invented time, literally invented time. He invented clocks and calendars and schedules and really delivered the world into the linear, monochronic world that we live in right now. The world before that was polychronic, but Sargon created the monochronic world and really thrust us into civilization, if you want to call it that. And so he understands this, Tolkien, and he's trying to show us that the Saturnian power came in and forced us into a kind of slavery, wrecking the planet, destroying the planet, and using up all the energy of the planet for its own devices. We don't really know, reading Lord of the Rings or watching the movies, we don't really know what it is that Sauron is trying to accomplish. Not really. And outside of conquering the world. And what it is he's trying to destroy the elves who know too much and have too much power, and he's trying to trap the earth into into an energy-sucking thing, and he's creating half-breeds of clones, the orcs and all those, who are not really human, and they're only partially human, just like the Archons. And he knows all this, and he's reading all this, and he's absorbing it, and he's getting it, and so this knowledge was in our own histories, and it has been wiped out by these Archons, these forces that don't want us to figure out, what's going on.
There's so much to Saturn. I've heard other people speculate also that obviously X amount of 1,000 years ago we had potentially a different composition in our own solar system, and that the fact that Saturn was much closer, the rings of Saturn was even visible from our planet, and that's that's the idea where we got the idea for adopting Saturn as being the lords of the planets in that sense. I don't know how much you've looked into that, Jay, but do you think that this is where they got the idea of venerating Saturn so much, or is there another connection to Saturn that we can talk about?
Well, I have heard and read that stuff, and it's intriguing, and there's no doubt that the solar system could have been rearranged in a periodic catastrophe of some kind. But I think what actually, Saturn is It is a device that is creating linear time in the solar system. It's a timing device, and it's a higher dimensional timing device that allows a semi-linear stream of time. And this is being done because the only way that certain powers can get things done is through taking us out of a polychronic world, i.e. hunter-gatherer or farmers or people who don't really, they just get up when the sun goes up and they go to bed when the sun goes down, to a monochronic world where we can all meet on airplanes and create machines and factories and go to work all at the same time. And so Saturn is the god that sets us. He sets us into something, and then we can't get out. And it's a trap. It's a time trap. And that's what I think Saturn is. And I think all the symbology around Saturn shows that it's a time trap. And he needs human sacrifice to keep going. In other words, old man time.
Right there. Think about that. Saturn is the god that sets us. So he says. And all you keep hearing is the great global reset. And it's been activated by the new King Charles of England, right? that the reset's on. Not by the World Economic Forum. They're the ones that made the public aware. Whether the public wants to believe it or not, this is what's going to happen. They made the public aware, but it's now been set into place by the King of England. I will also leave a video in the description box so you can read the King's tweet. Human sacrifice, they said, is what's required for this resetting of time. You're going out of one age into a new age, right? The human sacrifice. You get it. We understand. You see large numbers of people dying. I think it's also going to come at the hands of starvation and a war. A war. Just bear with me for a moment. You know those videos about the orphan trains? Listen closely to some of those people when they speak about it, because they tell you about the Freemasons, or the Freemason that founded the orphan trains, right? And they'll tell you, this was a 33rd degree Freemason. He had all these, he and other Masons had all these cities that were empty. Now you have to ask yourself, why were these cities empty? What happened to the original people in the land here in North America to cause it to be empty? We don't have to speculate. I mean, I believe they were, up and moved, or they were murdered, given cases like was it the Red Summer, those kind of things, So now you have these cities that are empty, and you got to listen closely to the wording, because they'll tell you it was after the Great Reset. They brought the orphan trains in, and what they do with the orphan trains filled the cities now, and with young children. That's why when I'm listening to these videos about Luciferians, they also speak about if a child hasn't adopted the Luciferian ways before the age of 7, the child is no good to them. So they train them hard from the age of 2 to 6 to get them ready, so they're fully, equipped to be a Luciferian. Those that grow up in a Luciferian home. I mean, you should hear some of the stuff. I mean, like setting a 2-year-old in a room with nothing to eat or drink. The child finally, when it gets hungry, they send the mother and father in. When the child cries and reaches for the mother smack this child with everything she's got, and repeats this method every few hours until the child finally gets it in its head. Stop reaching for mom. Stop crying. And then the whole thing is, the lesson to get to the bottom of it is that you're supposed to deny what you want, and you only ask for what you need. Wow. Come on. You can't find an easier way to get these lessons across. You can't find life lessons, simple life things to demonstrate. This is a want leads to bad things. Wants leads to lust, and these things needs. These are good things. Now you're actually saving your energy and putting it in the right direction. So you almost see a scenario with that and what the Romans did to the Hebrew people at one point, kicking the parents out of the city, leaving the children there so they can indoctrinate them. You see the same thing with the orphan trains, taking the children from their parents, bring them in, indoctrinating them teaching them, programming them basically to be what they want them to be. You see the same thing coming here, and you heard it with the Moors, right? There's going to come a time where the parents will beg the Moors to free their children, right? And so you hear, so you think about it, you almost see a situation where the United States has been planning with other nations to go to war, to have a war that's going to bring back none of the parents. That's what it seems like. Every man and woman over a certain age that, because they're citizens and so on and so forth, will be drafted into a war to go to these places, knowing that, them not knowing it, but their commanders knowing you're never coming home. Meanwhile, now your children that are under a certain age will be left in the hands of the state to raise. And who's going to raise them? The ones that were chosen not to go to war? The ones that are going to be fitting a political narrative? You know what I mean? Far left. Now they're raising all these children in this great reset. I'm just saying, I see that as what's being laid out. And then, to end all this, it's like when all this becomes a massive failure, they'll have military veterans, come out, like the ones that have been like, I think of like, who was that guy that ran with Bush? I can't think of his name right now. His daughter's running for president, and she's trying to use that whole thing where she speaks out against Trump, even though she's supposed to be running as a Republican. Shoot. I can't think of his name right now. He was the guy that, Dick Cheney. I think see guys like that, Dick Cheney, those guys, warmongers will be the ones that get to stay here, and now they'll get to take over and run the country after democracy fails and stuff like that. So, but
it turned into young baby time only through the sacrifice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there's a sacrifice that has to happen, and he's carrying, the scythe because he's the Grim Reaper also.
That's right.
He's and he's coming through, and he's gathering up the bodies. Well, what is he gathering up the bodies for? What does he need that for? Because he's sucking the energy of those bodies. That's what he's doing. And he's the Grim Reaper. So he's the Grim Reaper, he's Father Time, he's Kronos, he's Satan, he's Set, he's he is the embodiment of this kind of time trap that we're all caught in right now. And when we can break from the time trap, then we'll be free of Saturn and things. But the solar system does look like it was constructed as a time trap for us. Why? I can't say, except slavery.
Or
Interesting. Yeah.
Or what if it was a time trap set for what's locked away in the stars? Just saying. That's what I hear.
In one of the mythological stories as well, he ends up eating his own children. We have this
That's
aspect
right.
of sacrifice again. It needs a sacrifice in order to continue its own process in one sense, and that's obviously an obvious tie-in to this idea that we have ritualistic / satanic sacrifices taking place at the same time as there is certain this weird sexual behavior that we talked about earlier, pedophilia, what have you. Seems we have the murder aspect tied in with that as well, don't we, Jay?
That's right. To me, it's all connected, and it's exactly what Stanley Kubrick is saying. The overarching story that connects all of his films together is that if only he'd been allowed to keep it Saturn in 2001, it would be clear and obvious that this is what he's doing. But unfortunately, he changed it to Jupiter, and the only reason that we even know that it was Saturn is because special effects technicians like Douglas Trumbull have come forth and said, they spent a year designing Saturn, and then they had to throw it out and go to Jupiter. But I think, yes, I think it's I'll just be explicit here. It is a Saturnian cult that is archon-based. And the archons, the word for archon in Greek is arctos, which means bear. Okay? So the secret word for archons among themselves is bear. And he put bears all over his films, everywhere. All over him. In AI, the kid has a genetically modified teddy bear.
That's right.
And he's saying, and think about this. Who would want to buy a 12-year-old lifelike boy that never ages? Would a mother really want a boy that never ages, never gets married, never goes to college, never has a job, never has a career? No. There's really only one group that would want a boy or a girl that would never age. Okay? Kubrick had to know this when he started it. And I believe, and I can prove, and I will prove, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that he was making a conspicuous film about a pedophile cult that was using these robots. And it was going to be explosive, believe me.
Interesting. I mean, overall, the bear cult seems to be one of the oldest animal worshipping cults there is on the planet as well. If we look at some of the art around the world in many of the cave systems and so forth as well,
right.
Bears are always coming up in one way or another. Now, do you personally believe that this has to do an astrological connection to Ursa Major, or is it, as you say here, is it more on the nose obvious that this is tied to Saturn then in some way? Are you saying?
Well, I have to get into kind of like odd hyperdimensional physics, but it's like if you want to enter into the Earth stream from outside, you've got to come in on the North Pole. It's a hyperdimensional thing, but it take me an hour or two to explain it in the physics of it. But the path of least resistance would be to come in at the North Pole. But the ancient texts, the Nag Hammadi, they insinuate that the archons come from the region of Saturn. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of people think, it means Set or Satan and all that. And it may be, I don't know. But so I believe that they enter in through the North Pole, and they come down in here and commiserate with us, and they
think about that, right? Think about that. Think about now. He's using the North Pole as the way, the port of the point of entry through this portal being Saturn, right? Now, I think it's interesting. The North Pole is not where everyone's sitting, right? Right. All these nations have come together as that, and it can put aside all their differences and all have their governments, there, right? The North seems, now I'm just saying from the knowledge I have, look at the places up there, look at what they're named. They seem to, be well settled by Great Britain, right? Like look at all the land above Canada, those islands. Seems to be the South Pole is where you have all these nations that seem to have problems politically, can somehow all coexist on the same chunk of land, Antarctica, and they don't want you going down there unless you've been given an invitation. And what does the book of Jeremiah say? Just thinking, I cannot quote that verse correctly. What was it? That God will come from Mount Peor out of the south. And you've heard me say this before, the Mongoloids in Mongolia, the shamans there, they teach that they don't build their structures facing south, the entrance of them facing south, because they believe evil spirits come from the south. And then last but not least, American Dad, right? They pointed this out then when the two parent characters were kicked out or decided to switch places with their children, and they were looking for apartments, and the price range that they had, they were told by the realtor they would have to look on the south side of town, and they were like, no, the south, nothing good ever comes out of the south. So I think he's pulling your leg there, or our legs, when he's trying to say this is the north, when it seems, all indications it's something in the south that seems to be evil or destructive.
Protect the life of the planet and of us. And that's what they're doing. And they're keeping the planet and us on life support so that they can continuously drain our energy. They love war and death. And the three religions of Jupiter or Jehovah are the warrior religions, the religions that want to kill and destroy. And I guess the ultimate wet dream of the chief archon is for the Islamists, the Christians, and the Jews to just murder each other in a gigantic ritual bloodbath.
Right.
And that does seem to be what is going on here. And the people who think that there's a democracy coming to Egypt are out of their minds. Muslim Brotherhood is one of the most radical organizations possible. Islam is, I'm not going to make any friends here, but Islam, as John Lash says, is the third variation of this disease, and it will be the worst. So we have a very dangerous thing going on here, where a Saturnian cult or a Jehovian cult is going to take over the world, and this Jehovian cult is ruled by a secret Saturnian cult. And it's really quite terrifying, and I don't know what's going to happen. Some of my favorite cities in Europe are being destroyed by the Islamists. I'm sorry to say it, but they're ruining everything, and they're ruining the United States. And these people are fanatics and scary, and they follow a vicious, bloodthirsty, warmongering God.
Well, pause right there. I also have to point out that there are those that can prove, and I just have to find the videos so I can share them, that take Afghanistan, for example. After the war in Afghanistan, books were sent to the children to educate them. They were written by the University of Idaho, and these books had given them lessons in Islam, but were radical lessons in Islam. Well, an investigation was done into that, and come to find out that these professors were doing this to see what the response was on these children. And as you would expect, these children adopted a radical belief of Islam. So as he's pointing out and pointing the finger at Islamic, and he's leaving out that this stuff has been, to a large portion, has been manipulated, like the Islam we see today. And don't forget the Catholic connection to all this. Who told Muhammad that he was going to be he had the marking of a prophet? It was a Catholic bishop who told him that. What did he marry? A rich Catholic nun? That's supposed to be an oxymoron, because the nun's supposed to give away everything because she's supposed to be married to Christ. But who funded his writing? Who gave him someone to write whatever this angel told him in a cave? It was his Catholic nun wife that was wealthy. After his version of Islam was mocked and made fun of, then the radical stuff came, right? So I'm just saying, it's not, he's taking shots at it when there's a CIA, which, that just stands for Catholic Central Intelligence, because of all the, look at everybody that's worked for the CIA and what seems to be their main religion, Catholicism. What are they connected to? The Pope. I'll find videos to share on that. And, so this is a religion that's controlled and being used well. So.
Basically.
I want to talk more about that in our next hour here as well. I know that